If you think that the Founding Fathers would be rolling in their graves right now, you're wrong, and you need to stick around with me for a second. This is from Chapter 5, titled A Kind of Revolution. The Constitution was a compromise between slaveholding interests of the South and moneyed interests of the North. For the purpose of uniting the 13 states into one great market for commerce, the Northern delegates wanted laws regulating interstate commerce and urged that such laws require only a majority of Congress to pass. The South agreed to this in return for allowing the trade in slaves to continue for 20 years before being outlawed. Charles Beard warned us that governments, including the government of the United States, are not neutral, that they represent the dominant economic interests, and that their constituents are intended to serve those interests. One of his critics, Robert E. Brown, who wrote Charles Beard and the Constitution, raises an interesting point. Granted that the Constitution omitted the phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which appeared in the Declaration of Independence, and substituted life, liberty, or property, well, why shouldn't the Constitution protect property? As Brown says about revolutionary America, practically everybody was interested in the protection of property because so many Americans owned property. However, this is misleading. True, there were many property owners, but some people had much more than others. A few people had great amounts of property. Many people had small amounts. Others had none. Jackson, Maine found that 1/3 of the population in the Revolutionary period were small farmers, while only 3% of the population had truly large holdings and could be considered wealthy. Still, 1/3 was a considerable number of people who felt they had something at stake in the stability of a new government. This was a larger base of support for government than anywhere in the world at the end of the 18th century. In addition, the city mechanics had an important interest in a government which would protect their work from foreign competition. As Stoughton Lynd put it, how is it that the city workingmen all over America overwhelmingly and enthusiastically support the United States Constitution? This was especially true in New York. When the 9th and 10th states had ratified the Constitution, 4,000 New York City mechanics marched with floats and banners to celebrate. Bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, ship joiners, and shipwrights, coopers, cartmen, and tailors all marched. What Lynd found was that these mechanics, while opposing elite rule in the colonies, were nationalist. Mechanics comprised perhaps half of the New York population. Some were wealthy, some were poor, but all were better off than the ordinary laborer. The apprentice, the journeyman, and their prosperity required a government that would protect them against the British hats and shoes and other goods that were pouring into the colonies after the Revolution. As a result, the mechanics often supported wealthy conservatives at the ballot box. The Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interest of a wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics and farmers to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the black people, the Indians, and the very poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control with a minimum of coercion, a maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. The Constitution became even more acceptable to the public at large after the first Congress, responding to criticism, passed a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments seemed to make the new government a guardian of people's liberties, to speak, to publish, to worship, to petition, to assemble, to be tried fairly, to be secure at home against official intrusion. It was therefore perfectly designed to build popular backing for the new government. What was not made clear, it was a time when the language of freedom was new and its reality untested, was the shakiness of anyone's liberty when entrusted to a government of the rich and powerful. Indeed, the same problem existed for the other provisions of the Constitution, like the clause forbidding states to impair the obligation of contract, or that giving Congress the power to tax the people and to appropriate the money. They all sound benign and neutral until one asks, tax who? For what? Appropriate what? For whom? To protect everyone's contracts seems like an act of fairness, of equal treatment, until one considers that contracts made between rich and poor, between employer and employee, landlord and tenant, creditor and debtor, I hate that word, generally favor the more powerful of the two parties. Thus, to protect these contracts is to put the great power of the government, its laws, courts, sheriffs, police, on the side of the privileged, and to do it not, as in pre-modern times, as an exercise of brute force against the weak, but as a matter of law. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights shows that quality of interest hiding behind innocence. Passed in 1791 by Congress, it provided that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Yet 7 years after the First Amendment became part of the Constitution, Congress passed a law very clearly abridging the freedom of speech. This was the Sedition Act of 1798, passed under John Adams's administration, at a time when Irishmen and Frenchmen in the United States were looked on as dangerous revolutionaries because of the recent French Revolution and the Irish rebellions. The Sedition Act made it a crime to write anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, Congress, or the president with intent to defame them, bring them to disrepute, or excite popular hatreds against them. This act seemed to directly violate the First Amendment, yet it was passed. 10 Americans were put in prison for utterances against the government, and every member of the Supreme Court in 1798 to 1800, sitting as an appellate judge, held it constitutional. There was a legal basis for this, one known to legal experts, but not to the ordinary American, who would read the First Amendment and feel confident that he or she was protected in the exercise of free speech. That basis has been explained by historian Leonard Levy. Levy points out that it was generally understood, not in the population, but in higher circles, that despite the First Amendment, the British common law of seditious libel still ruled in America. This meant that while a government could not exercise prior restraint, that is, prevent an utterance or publication in advance, it could legally punish the speaker or writer afterward. Thus, Congress has a convenient legal basis for the laws it has enacted since that time, making certain kinds of speech a crime. And since punishment after the fact is an excellent deterrent to the exercise of free expression, the claim of no prior restraint itself is destroyed. This leaves the First Amendment much less than the stone wall of protection it seems at first glance.